Welcome to our Yud Shevat Farbrengen and event celebrating the leadership of the Rebbe and the 3 years of Chabad of Efrat-English division. Before we start, I want to thank our sponsors, Toby and Chaya Kram, David and Helaine Brenner, sponsoring in honor of Kiki's grandfather who passed away today. Izzy and Sharon Katz, who also sponsored in honor of Kiki's grandfather. I want to thank our videographer, a beautiful video that we'll be featuring today about the work that Chabad has been doing in Efrat and some personal accounts. Our videographer, Alex Gorev, and our editor, Sivan Felder. I want to thank the Shluchim to Efrat that brought us here, the Nachshons, Rabbi Nissen and Sarah Nachshon, and the Yehudis and Shimon Leiter, who were the ones that made the Shadchanim and the ones that spoke to us and brought us here. Thank you all very, very much. I'm going to put Yossi on the mic to introduce Dr. Weiss.
Thank you very much, Rabbi and Rebbetzin Newman. It was a beautiful presentation. I'm going to be very short because Dr. Weiss is here already, and we don't want to waste any of his time. Anybody who joined this program because the title of the speaker is doctor, and they think they're going to get a corona update or a pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine, let not your heart be troubled. We're going to, Mirza Hashem, not talk about that at all. Dr. Weiss is a famous cardiologist in practice for many decades. But to someone, Chabad, like myself, and who grew up, with the legend and the myths and the stories of Dr. Weiss as the chassid and the celebrity. Dr. Weiss first came in touch with the Rebbe in 1977 when the Rebbe had a major heart attack. And I'm going to let Dr. Weiss share his the story of how that came to be, obviously. And as the Rabbi mentioned, if anybody has any questions, Dr. Weiss will speak. And then if anybody has any questions, feel free to message me over here on Zoom, or you can message my cell phone, 052-581-3041, and I'll be happy to pass those questions on to Dr. Weiss. As somebody that grew up after, that was born after the Rebbe's heart attack in 1977, often we would hear that there are many holidays in Chabad, right? People laugh at Chabad. You have what's today? Thursday, you have a Farbrengen for this, and then Monday you have another Farbrengen for this. It's true. A reason to celebrate, to say L'chaim, we're never going to complain. But we always heard about Rosh Chodesh Kislev, which was the day when the Rebbe recovered from that major heart attack. That was our Yom Tov. That was our holiday. It wasn't something that happened with the Alter Rebbe, the Admor Zaken, 250 years ago. It wasn't the Baal Shem Tov or Russia. This was our Rebbe that was unfortunately very sick. And then all of a sudden we got him back. And that was always the major celebration that we had. And Dr. Weiss, who we're going to hear from, had a very big hand in that story, starting from the very beginning all the way through. And without any more introductions, Dr. Weiss, take it away, b'chavod.
Thank you, Yossi, and also a greeting to Rabbi Newman and Rebbetzin Newman, and my thanks to all of you for inviting me to join you, because the story is a long one, I hope not a boring one, but it does involve the hearts and spirit of Chabad in the past several decades, and I'm very privileged to have been part of it. Actually, I was never a major Chabadnik before I got called. I was privileged to have had a cheder education, having gone to public school in Chicago. I was privileged to have had a cheder education at a Agudas Chabad, a little cheder run by my very dear teachers, Rabbi Herschel Schusterman and his wife Chava. And this was from the early 1950s. And in fact, since this is the 70th Yahrzeit of the previous Rebbe. It was actually at that time when we moved into the neighborhood where the Buddhist Chabad was. So in a sense, my own career in Chabad really, in a sense, coincided exactly to the year, to the month almost, of the Rebbe's taking leadership a year after the previous Rebbe passed away. And although I didn't know the previous Rebbe or the current Rebbe, at the time I was a little Cheder student, I was always keenly aware of their impact. For example, Rabbi Schusterman, who started his first assignment, was in Rochester, New York. He was called to Chicago, and it was my good fortune that he came to the very neighborhood where we had moved. And I went to his little Cheder to have one-on-one teaching and really close feeling about the Rebbe. I didn't ever meet the Rebbe before I was called to this assignment, but I certainly knew a lot about the Rebbe. And my younger brother was even privileged to be with the Rebbe in the early years of his leadership, to sit almost at his table side during Pesach. And neither of us had any idea what privilege that was. We had no idea how one couldn't have been given that privilege just randomly, but it left a little bit of an impact on me as well. So years go by, and I'm already finished my medical training, and I spent several years in Boston doing that training. But in the first year of my practice, it's Shmini Atzeres Simchas Torah. We had a wonderful night finishing up in the Sukkah the night before, and I get up the next morning, getting ready for Shmini Atzeres, and the phone rings, and I have an emergency medical phone in our bedroom, and I'm just getting ready to prepare for shul that morning. And to my surprise, on the end of the phone is Rabbi Yehuda Krinsky, one of the members of the Rebbe's secretariat. There was Rabbi Krinsky, Rabbi Groner, and Rabbi Benjamin Klein. And Rabbi Krinsky was in a state of such severe stress. I could hear it on the phone, even not having ever met him before. I knew he was the brother of Rebbetzin Schusterman, who was one of my dear teachers. As I said, the Schustermans were the ones who taught me in my childhood and were very dear to my heart. And I knew of Rabbi Krinsky because I knew I had heard his name before, but we had never met. And he was calling in a state of frenzy and sadness because he wanted to ask me a moral question. Here was the issue. He told me that the night before the Rebbe turned ill at the big Farbrengen for Shmini Atzeres Simchas Torah, and the Rebbe really, in front of everybody, lost his blood pressure, lost his strength, had to sit down, had to be fanned to cool him off, and he was really losing ground. And he had made a pronouncement to his Hasidim who surrounded him, who all called upon the doctors who happened to be randomly in attendance that night. And they all said, without any equivocation, that the Rebbe belonged in a coronary care unit at a decent hospital to be given a chance to pull through this crisis. And yet the Rebbe, with clear mind at that time, clearly stated to the Hasidim surrounding him and the doctors giving him the recommendation to go to the hospital that he did not want to leave 770 for his care. He agreed to get care, but he asked that it be done specifically at 770. He did not want to leave his Hasidim. And there were a number of other reasons which became clear much later in the game why he came to this opinion. And his wife, Rebbetzin Schneerson, heard his firm opinion that he wanted to remain at 770, did not want to go to a hospital. But now, with Rabbi Krinsky calling me at 7 in the morning the next morning, the Rebbe was not strong enough even to be talking. His blood pressure had sagged to that point. His cardiac output, the pump output of the heart had sagged to that point that he could no longer even communicate in the way he normally would. And Rabbi Krinsky was asking me the moral question of whether it would be correct to take our own initiative and bring him to a hospital while he's not able to be aware of what's going on. And I told Rabbi Krinsky, I've never met the Rebbe, but I heard about his greatness. I've learned from my teachers, the Schustermans in Chicago, what it means to be a Rebbe, what it means to be a follower of a Rebbe. And I said, really, with all the accomplishments that were known to be to his credit, I said, I really don't know how we could override his strong wish that he not be brought to a hospital. But on the other hand, we can't leave him there just to languish and become sicker and sicker to the point where we can't retrieve him anymore, God forbid. So I told Rebbe Krinsky that in a case like this, I would say that the best choice might be to recruit the proper medical talent right at hand and create for him a little mini hospital at 770 with all the facilities needed to help bring him through. Now, this requires cardiac monitoring. It requires a staff of doctors and people who know medicine who can bring the material and equipment and medicines that are needed and on the spot. You don't wait for the next day for the delivery. You have to have these things right away. And you have to have the equipment to do the monitoring. And you have to have people who have the know-how to take a person back to normal rhythm if their rhythm becomes abnormal. I said, if you can recruit talent like that, that's one way to do it, because my own teachers in Boston had done this for famous personages. Like someone in the White House once needed this kind of private care so that no one would go to the press and say, this president can't do this and can't do that because of this and that. And that was done for the Baroness de Rothschild when she was going by her own private plane to have cardiac surgery in a whole different country, a whole different region of the world, actually. And we had a team from our unit go on her with a plane, and she indeed had a cardiac arrest while on that plane ride. And we were right there to defibrillate her, bring her back, and she had a heart valve successfully. It was an amazing undertaking, but it showed me that it could be done. I told Rebbe Krinsky about this, and I then put the phone down, hoping to hear later after Yom Tov that they got the job done. But 2 or 3 minutes later, maybe 3 or 4 minutes later, Rebbe Krinsky calls me back on the same emergency medical phone. He said, Dr. Weiss, I looked high and low. We talked to all the doctors here. No one feels qualified to do this. No one has the proper connections, even though they live in New York, they don't have the proper connections to get this kind of equipment brought in immediately. And they won't know how to do this so that the Rebbe can be treated competently and safely. And he then said, Dr. Weiss, could you be the one who comes in and prepares this unit for the Rebbe? And you have to realize I was only 33 years old then, only 1 year into my new job in Chicago. I didn't have connections at all in New York as far as I could ascertain. I had no idea how I would recruit equipment and who would listen to me anyway, because I'm not even licensed to practice medicine in New York. And I said to Rebbe Krinsky, I said, I'm not the man for the job. But Rebbe Krinsky said, we have no one else to turn to. And I really felt such rachmanas for the situation, especially for the Rebbe, and especially for Rebbe Krinsky. I said, I'll just have to come in and do what I can do to try to help. I, of course, felt I made a grave mistake. Here I was 1 year in my new job, assuredly going to be relieved, dismissed from this job because I was working with non-Jewish doctors in a group. I was the cardiologist in this group. I didn't have any leg to stand on. And also, I wasn't going to be making a million calls and delay my travel to New York to call them, to tell them what I'm doing. I'd have to make that call later from New York or have someone non-Jewish from New York explain to them. So I knew that was like suicide on the job right away. And we weren't well off enough to even lose a job. I mean, we were, beginners in life. We were a young family with two little baby girls. And my wife was so upset by this decision to leave suddenly. Fortunately, I thought, and I came up with an idea. I said that, actually one of my favorite teachers in Boston is now the head of cardiology at Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan. And I said, I don't want to spend a lot of time on the phone trying to reach him, but maybe I'll be lucky enough to call him and explain what's wrong, and maybe he could think of someone to send there and take care of matters and do it right. And as you've all probably had experience in calling a hospital or calling any official organization that's as complicated as a hospital, you don't just make a phone call and then talk to the person you're trying to reach. You're going to be called back, or he's in a meeting, he might call you back later. But I called the switchboard operator there. In those days, they didn't have automatic switchboards. It was all the patch cords on a big switchboard, like you might see in old black and white movies. The lady was so attentive to my call, she could hear the stress in my voice. She said, Dr. Weiss, it happens that the Department of Cardiology at Mount Sinai Hospital is right down the hall. I'm going to leave my switchboard and I'm going to bring the doctor you want. And I wanted to reach a Dr. Louis Tischel, who was a very dear teacher of mine. She actually went down the hall, pulled him by the ear, brought him to the switchboard, and he talked to me and heard the whole story. Now, Dr. Tischholz is a wonderful, wonderful hearted Jew. and the kindest person you could meet, and who would only do good for others. But he wasn't really one who knew about the Rebbe. He had heard about the Rebbe, but he wasn't involved in that much that he would have known about the Rebbe. And he heard my story. He said, Dr. Weiss, Ira Weiss, he told me, Ira, he said, it's a big assignment, but I know that you need help badly, and I'm going to drop what I'm doing to help you. And I couldn't believe my ears that he was going to be doing all this, realizing that I had about 4 or 5 hours till I could get to New York. By the time I get a plane, by the time I drive to the O'Hare Airport and find a parking space in the airport, find a ticket on a plane, get on that plane, get a transportation from the airport to, it would be at least 4 hours. And he said he will do his best. And as I learned later, he was doing this having been invited to give a major presentation to the world about the new technology called echocardiography, which he pioneered with a few others in the whole world. So he was dropping an assignment that was really on his shoulders. And he had this responsibility, which he was just dropping because I happened to call, having not talked to him for several years while I was doing research. I hadn't seen him for several years from the time I finished my training in Boston. I didn't know how this would work, but I then waited to get to the bank. I didn't have any cash in the house. There were credit cards in the market, but we didn't have a credit card. I had to wait for the bank to open at 9 o'clock to get the cash for the trip, take our only car and drive it into O'Hare Airport, which is a large, large airport in Chicago. I think it's the largest airport in the world, to be honest, and park it somewhere. And of course, I was so tumult and so worried that this was not going to work that I didn't even remember where I parked the car, but I ran then in to get an American Airlines ticket. And luckily, 10 minutes later, the plane was leaving. They had not closed the gates yet. It wasn't a day when they had all the security check in the airport. And I hopped on the plane. And there I started to daven with all my heart. I opened my little Tehillas Hashem Siddur, which after the brachas is the recitation of the Akedas Yitzchak, the story of the binding of Isaac, the sacrifice, potential sacrifice of Isaac. And there I read that Yitzchak asked his father innocently, he said to Avram, his father, said, Father, I see the wood and I see the fire, but where is the sacrifice? And Avraham didn't know how to answer his question directly, so he said, God will provide us the sacrifice, the lamb, my son. And I broke into added tears, realizing that I was as lost as Yitzchak. How's this going to work out? And I was as lost as Avraham. How's this going to work out? How am I going to give away my son to God and explain this to myself, to my heart, to my wife, Sarah? And I said, I should only hope with all my heart that God will help me through this mission, which looks absolutely impossible, to go into this land I don't know, with doctors and hospital connections that I don't have, with licensure that I don't have, and get this done successfully. And I just spent the 2-hour plane trip thinking this way and davening with all my heart. When I got out of the airport, I went right to the cab stand to get a cab to Crown Heights. I've never been on Crown Heights. I knew it was in Brooklyn. And I go up to the dispatcher at the LaGuardia airport. And he tells me, sir, we aren't sending any cabs into that neighborhood because there was a murder in the last week in the neighborhood. And there was a racial matter. And there's such racial tension that we can't allow any cab drivers or any livery people to go there for their own safety, for the safety of the equipment, and for the safety of the passengers. I said, what am I supposed to do? He said, well, you can take a bus from here to Jackson Heights, and there you'll find a train, I think it's the number 7 train or something like that, and another train, and you'll be able to get to Crown Heights by the bus and the train. So there's 3 connections, and I don't even know the routes to be sure I know where I'm going. I said, I'll never get there. I'll be there so late that it'll be a totally worthless mission, and we'll have lost a chance to help the Rebbe, God forbid. So I decided to go back into the airport and violate the signs that that those days were all over the airport. It is against the law to recruit private transportation. If you're caught doing this, there's a certain fine and penalty. And I began to ask people if they could drive me to a neighborhood called Crown Heights in Brooklyn. And lo and behold, within minutes, I was apprehended by the police. I said, oh no, it's like all over. They're going to start apprehending me, questioning me why I'm seeking illegal transportation. And the officer was very nice. He said, "Sir, are you Dr. Weiss from Chicago? Are you a cardiologist, Dr. Weiss from Chicago?" I said, I am, but how do you know me? How? He said, I had been called by Rabbi Krinsky to look for someone in the airport, relatively young, wearing a kippah. And who would be wearing a kippah on Shmini Atzeres? But someone who's on a medical mission. You wouldn't be going to the airport for almost any other reason, I could imagine. And within minutes, I was whisked into the officer's car and motorcaded like lightning across Queens and into Brooklyn. I couldn't believe my luck. I said, I can't believe suddenly things start, a ray of sunshine comes in. However, the sunshine suddenly dimmed when I got out of the police escort, because when they opened the door and the people took one look at me, well, I look pretty old now, I will agree. But back in those days, I was 33 and looked about 10 years younger. Everyone always told me you look 10 years younger, which means I'm only 10 years away from having been bar mitzvah. And there's a big sea of people all dressed in black kappatas, all looking very, very down, fearing the worst. And they suddenly see coming out of this police escort, as they start separating the people to allow me to come to the door, they suddenly see a kid coming out of the car. And on this, they're putting the whole hope for the Rebbe. And there wasn't a happy expression on people's faces. It got from bad to worse for them, because they said, oh, they're going to have a young kid who doesn't even know what he's doing, taking care of our Rebbe when we hear such reports that it's so serious. To make matters worse, suddenly a tall fellow jumps upon me with his kapot almost enshrouding me. And I thought maybe he's trying to put me down so I won't touch their Rebbe and hurt their Rebbe with my inexperience. It turned out it was a very nice man from South Africa. He said, Dr. Weiss, as you're walking to the door of 770, I just want to tell you, I'm Mr. So-and-so, whose wife you saved 4 years ago. I said, well, I do remember a call from South Africa. Was your wife the one who had a bacterial septic problem after having had a child? He said, it was me. And he said, do you remember how you saved my wife? I said, well, I remember that I had a contact of mine at the Harvard system where I was training, who told me there was one and only one doctor who could do the job right, Dr. Monty Zion in South Africa. And just let him know to call Dr. Monty Zion, and they'll take care of this woman properly. And I get a call back from him 4 years before my assignment that Dr. Monty Zion is on a safari in Kenya and he cannot be reached. I said, oh no. So I remembered that when I was dating my wife before we got engaged, she lived in a building where a lot of the graduate students at Harvard lived. And I saw a name, Barbara Zion, on one of the mailboxes. And I once had occasion to ask her if my wife-to-be was in that day. And I heard a British accent. So I said, maybe Barbara Zion is not British, maybe she's South African. So I made contact with her and she said, yes, Dr. Monty Zion is my father. And he's on a safari right now in Kenya. But we know how to reach him by shortwave radio in case of an emergency. So lo and behold, she reaches her father by shortwave radio, and the rest is history. She saved this cousin's wife, and he was giving me a big hug to tell me in person. So suddenly a second ray of sunshine came up, and I came to the door of 770, and greeting me at the door was Rabbi Krinsky and the other secretariat, and also Rebbetzin Schneerson, who was a magnificent, refined lady. People didn't know her very well because she was a private person, as I heard later, but she was so delicate and dainty and refined and smart. And she said, Dr. Weiss, I want to tell you a good news that your friend, Dr. Tischholz, came in from Mount Sinai Hospital several hours ago, and he had all the equipment he needed to get things started. And they've already restored my husband's strength and ability to talk. His pressure is normal now. And I said, it sounds just like Dr. Tischholz. And I said, that's amazing. And if any of you want to relate the story to anyone else, you might say, it wasn't Dr. Weiss who saved the Rebbe, it was Dr. Tischholz who saved the Rebbe. His initial moves, his initial chess moves on the board were the critical moves. And he alone put together a coronary care unit that was magnificently effective to bring the Rebbe back. So much so that the Rebbetzin said, Dr. Weiss, before you see my man, as she said, my husband, I would like you to make Kiddush because it is Shmini Atzeres. And I said, Rebbetzin, I came here to help your husband. I don't want to be rude, but I think I better see him right away and then we can make Kiddush a little later. She said, I would tell you that he'll be happier to hear that you made Kiddush first too. So I had to listen to her. I wasn't exactly happy about it, a little bit reluctant, but when I got to meet her, and the Kiddush was a short and sweet little Kiddush that I just enjoyed meeting her and was so heartened to hear that she herself, with strength in her voice, said, my husband is regaining his life. So we made the Kiddush, and then I went to see the Rebbe and talked with Dr. Tischel. So the three of us were together, and it was unbelievable. The Rebbe was already looking with his characteristic bright eyes at you, with great ability to concentrate. It was like so miraculous to see from what I had heard from Rebbe Krinsky and what I saw in this devastating electrocardiogram, which was really, a very severe representation of a heart attack. I said, this was not a minor thing that Dr. Tischel did. And, we might say what God did for us, but we had a chance to talk to the Rebbe. And the Rebbe, right from the start, asked such meaningful questions. He first wanted to know what was the detail, what actually had happened. And so Dr. Tischel and I explained to the Rebbe that a major part of his heart had become infarcted or injured from the lack of blood flow, and the remaining part of the heart was doing the contracting. So instead of the ventricle contracting like this, the pumping chamber contracting like this, it was contracting like this. So part of the heart was doing all the work, and the part that was nullified by the lack of blood flow was sort of motionless, or even maybe bulging out in the wrong direction. And the Rebbe immediately asked, do we have any way of restoring the weakened muscle? A very logical question to ask. I said, because of the number of hours that have passed since your arteries became blocked, it's really hard to imagine that we could restore the heart muscle. And in those days, we didn't have emergency stenting. That was not developed for at least 10 years subsequently. We would have to send someone to the operating room to have the whole chest opened and put in new bypass arteries if we were to do anything like that. And of course, in the Rebbe state, that would have not allowed him to live. He would have had no way of having the strength to pull through an open chest operation like that. So we told the Rebbe that with all the hours that passed since last night, we had to accept that this part of the muscle is going to be dead and this part will do the contracting. But the Rebbe objected. He said, Dr. Weiss, have you not heard of stem cell research? And I admitted that I'd heard the word stem cell, but I don't really know how to engage that. I wasn't really learned of stem cells, nor was Dr. Tischel aware of what was going on in stem cell research. Even though to us it's a word we just throw out in normal conversation in the street, it was a very new technology, and it was used to show that certain fundamental cells in the body can be differentiated into any number of lines of cells: neural cells, muscular cells, heart cells, brain cells. And this is becoming more and more of reality. The first muscle cells that were developed from stem cells was done about 12 years after the Rebbe's heart attack. So this was way in advance of anyone developing this technology. And I was amazed that the Rebbe would know about this. Later on, when I had a chance to talk to Rabbi Krinsky, I said, how would the Rebbe ever know that? He said, Dr. Weiss, he spends a lot of his time reading science. He reads the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and he reads the magazine Science. These are some of his reading material. I said, really? Then we described how we're going to treat his heart. And the Rebbe came up with a mechanical idea that was very logical. And it was ahead of its time too. The Rebbe was trained, as you may know, as a mechanical engineer in Sorbonne. His graduate work was in mechanical engineering. And he said when he was a child, he remembers growing up watching soap bubbles, that as you put more air into a soap bubble, of course, it expands. And the tension in the wall of the soap bubble gets greater and greater. And as we all know, if we blow hard enough on a bubble, it'll burst because the wall tension gets that great. The Rebbe said, if you can run my heart at the smallest possible volume, will make the tension in the wall as low as possible. And this will allow whatever muscle is left to do its job better than to have an overwhelmingly large heart with a lot more stretch on the walls and a lot more tension for these weak muscles to have to. I said, this is perfectly logical, Rebbe, and it's being developed in the field of cardiology as a standard way of looking at this. And the Rebbe then said, well, how can we make the heart smaller? I said, well, the most important thing is probably to reduce the sodium or salt in the diet. So the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin got together and put their heads together to devise a diet for their little household that would have kosher food, but not kosher food, because koshering involves the addition of an unknown amount of salt, often quite a prodigious amount of salt. In addition, they decided to look at all the ways soups were being prepared by the steward of the household, which was Chesed Halberstam. And so the three of them had a little skull session together where they worked out a low sodium diet that was really effective and that they would follow. And I'll tell you, the Rebbe made his heart physically smaller by echocardiographic measurements that Dr. Tischhold meant so that he got maximum efficiency out of his heart. So these were amazing initial encounters. These were in the first days of encountering the Rebbe, that he was coming up with ideas of how to make the heart more efficient. I've never had a patient, especially one who comes in so sick as he did, to come up with engineering ideas of how to make this work better. In other words, to do more than is just done to guide a patient through. And of course, Dr. Tischholz and I, in our private moments, we conferred with each other, along with some other people I'll mention in just a minute, other very fine doctors. We all agreed that this was a very extensive heart attack. How is the Rebbe ever going to be expected to be the Rebbe again? To be a Rebbe requires endless energy, endless hours, and endless strength. I don't mean just mental strength, I mean physical strength. And to be an effective Rebbe, you have to be one who people will see or seek. If we tell them that he's had a very extensive heart attack, it may ruin any chance that he'll be a Rebbe again, because people will not want to come to bother them with their personal matters, or matters in their business, or matters in their country, whatever the situation might be. So we had to be very delicate, but honest in telling people what was going on. In fact, I was asked the first day to go out where the Farbrengens were still held for Simchas Torah, to tell the crowd what had happened. And I said the Rebbe had had a heart attack. It was substantial enough for him to require specialized care, but I didn't go into further detail. I didn't want to tell them that it was all over for the Rebbe as a Rebbe. And I didn't want to admit, as Dr. Tischholz and I talked, I said that the potential longevity here is not expected to be very high, not to mention the lack of strength to be a Rebbe. So I just said that we will do our very best. We will commit ourselves to try to help the Rebbe regain his strength. And I left it at that. I didn't tell any lies, and I didn't make any false promises. I just said we will try our very best, which of course we did. And then they asked me, well, Dr. Weiss, can you give us a nigun? And I wasn't prepared for, I was a Cheder student, Chassid. I wasn't full of nigunim in my mind of what the Chabad sings at nigunim, at Chabad. But as luck would have it, 4 years ago, so when we first got married, my wife and I, one of my wife's students at Wellesley College, where she taught in Wellesley, Massachusetts, invited us over for tea at their home. And they were watching PBS, Public Broadcasting System, on the television. And it happened that PBS was featuring a program that Sunday on religions of the world. And it happened the day we showed up, it was about Chabad. And I go in the room there with, in the living room, they're watching the TV, and I see the Rebbe singing at a Farbrengen, and I see the kind of energy he puts into on the podium, and spirit, and dancing, and l'chaim to everybody. And then they sing, Hoshia es Amecha. And I said, that's the only song I know that'll be accepted here. So and of course the words are easy to remember because they're in the daily prayers. So I sang the song, and I even put in a little bit of the dramatics of the Rebbe, and that won the allegiance of the crowd to me, even though I looked kind of young for the job, but it was like magic. And I think people ask, how did you become such a big chassid? I said, I never became a chassid, but I became beloved by the Hasidim just because I could sing a nigun that was just right. And of course, Hoshia Samecha is a perfectly good song to sing on Simchas Torah, naturally. But it was really a magic moment by itself, and a little bit of magic before the assignment, to have heard this program on PBS 4 years earlier and remembered the Rebbe's way of doing it from the podium. So I was already brought in in a sense, as part of the brotherhood of the Chabad, without even trying. But it was very lucky. We had many times of to be with the Rebbe. We recruited an unusually nice team. It happens that the State Department of the United States was aware of the Rebbe's importance for the national security of the country, because the Rebbe had so many contacts around the world that were vital to the State Department, especially his contacts in the USSR, it was called USSR then. And so they flew my teacher, my principal cardiology teacher, Bernard Laun, in from China the next day to be one of our helpers, so that they could assure that the State Department could assure themselves that they did all they could to save the Rebbe. Dr. Laun was on a research mission to start a research liaison on certain things in basic research on cardiology with the Chinese. We were just opening the doors to trade with China at that time, and we were opening the doors for scientific exchange at that time. And Dr. Laun came in and was very helpful to us as a senior member of our cardiology team. We also had another doctor, Dr. Larry Resnick, and Larry Resnick was at that time serving his Army period, obligatory Army period that we all doctors served at the time of the Vietnam War. And he was the head of an Army hospital in Honolulu, where they had a naval station, Army and naval station, strategically located at that point. And he was brought in by the State Department to transfer to be the head of an Army hospital in Staten Island, so he could be on hand regularly to take care of the Rebbe while taking care of the hospital. So it turns out that Dr. Larry Resnick and I were Cheder students together. And we were pretty silly Cheder students at that time. When we would finish davening on Shabbos with chakras, we didn't want to waste time listening to the Torah. We would run outside and start punching and screaming and playing chase and all that kind of stuff that little kids do. So he was my punching bag bunny. And here he was to join the effort of taking care of the Rebbe. It's just like a fairy tale, all these stories, but they're all true. And so we had Dr. Resnick. We had also a very nice doctor in the community, Dr. Bob Feldman, who was a very hardworking internist, who was so devoted to his patients. I don't think the man ever slept. And now he had an additional responsibility to help us. And Dr. Tischholz, brilliantly, Dr. Tischholz was the developer of telemonitoring for the space program. Telemonitoring is routine. When you go to a hospital, you have telemonitors and you have little transmitters. But in those days, you were wired with almost like coaxial cable from your body to the monitor. You as a patient could not get out of bed very easily, let alone get to the bathroom, let alone have any privacy, let alone have any feeling that you are anything but a patient strapped to these coaxial cables transmitting your heart rhythm to this monitoring station down the hall to the nursing station. Dr. Tischholz had telemonitors, bing, 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 under the kapot of the Rebbe. Looked like a Rebbe. He could go, if he had to go to the washroom, he'd have his privacy. If he had to get up or to say something, he could, move around to the limits of what his heart would allow. But it was so different from a hospital that I begin to immediately see what the Rebbe saw in staying at 770, not being at a hospital, because he wouldn't have been a Rebbe in the hospital. He would have been kind of chained to a bed with these cables and all these restrictions and all this lack of privacy. So it was already coming clear to me what was different about our unit from a hospital. The other thing that was different in our little unit is we had 5 or 6 doctors joining together, and I was like the coordinator. And my rule was no one works more than 4 hours a day. But in those 4 hours, you work. You don't take phone calls from other people. You don't get distracted. If your wife has to call you, she'll call outside those 4 hours. And if you know a doctor's routine, some doctors are burned out just by working such long hours. I was, as an intern at Mass General, I would work contracted work as 36 hours on, 12 hours off. So every 2 days, you have 12 hours to sleep, and really are so wiped out by the intensive work for the 36 hours, where you were really responsible for so many things all at once. And so we made it so that when a doctor was off, he was off. And when a doctor was on, he was really on. He was also the pharmacist. He was the nurse. He was the transcriptionist. He was a record keeper. And so the possibility of miscommunication, unless you don't talk to yourself correctly, the possibility of miscommunication was eliminated. As all doctors know, it's really hard to have perfect communication at all times in the complexity of a hospital. especially when many specialties are involved or many departments, like a transcription error or something, misdelivery of pharmacy item to the wrong unit with a delay, and all these little things, misrecording of things in the chart. These really are costly human errors that are inevitable when you're working in such a complex environment. This was all eliminated. It was really such an unusual hospital that I saw clearly what it was like for the Rebbe. And I had a totally different experience when his brother-in-law, the Rashad, Rebbe Shmaryahu Barari, was sick one time with a stroke. He went to the hospital, a very good hospital on the east side of Manhattan. And there, so many things befell him for the very reasons that I described, the miscommunications, this and that it was actually a tortured mess for him. He got out alive and did make some kind of recovery, partial recovery. But I'll tell you, if the Rebbe had been put through that, he wouldn't have had the strength to be tolerant of all the things that go on in a hospital. I don't want to tell any of you not to take your family to a hospital, of course, if they're sick, because that's the best thing available. You're not going to get the kind of thing set up for the Rebbe, but you have to be wary of all the shortcomings of any complex institution. When you're taking care of a patient in a hospital, have a relative in a hospital, you have to be on the lookout for all the little things that have to be carefully watched. So this was really a remarkable thing. In the course of time, I spent 2 weeks there, then I went back to my work, and of course, as I expected, I was politely but definitely relieved of my assignment. I moved from Boston to Chicago, now without a job. We didn't have a whole lot of money in the bank either. I must say we were like poor as church mice, as they say, and we had to make our way. And I did my very best to recruit my own personal practice without a group of doctors. It turned out to be a bracha in a sense, because I really have a bend not to charge patients, not to give them any billing, whether they have co-pays or deductibles. In Israel, you don't have that problem because of a nationalized health system. But in America, it's quite the opposite. You really can go broke paying all these doctors' fees and co-pays, deductibles, this and that. If you ever have some time to hear about these stories, they're pretty bad stories. So I had the privilege of saying to my patients, no one has to pay me anything. If I can navigate to some extent with your insurance, even if there's a big deductible, I'll accept that. And I was very happy to be able to be my own private person who didn't have a billing system against patients. So no one ever paid me a red cent on my wish. It was a very good strategy. I liked it very much. I enjoyed the privilege of sharing with my medical knowledge that I was privileged to learn with patients to help them and not worry about the finances. We never went broke. We lived on a lower scale, maybe than some other doctors, that were privileged to do that. I think all my kids grew up better for that and everything. I think there's a value in not being overloaded with cash. Sufil. That's the worst word in the dictionary. Sufil. Too much of anything is no good. Even too much kindness is no good. And of course, too much material possession is no good, and too little. So su is the worst word in the dictionary. But that was eliminated by the new structure of my practice. My contact with the Rebbe was probably every few weeks. I would come in by plane for a quick visit over a night of a Farbrengen or a night just to see how things were going. But I had my hand on things mostly through Rebbe Schneerson, whom I would call every night at her home. On my time, it was 10 o'clock when I finally schlepped home from the hospital. And on her time, it was 11 o'clock. She would stay up any hour to get the call. And she was very well prepared for these calls. Not only did she have a full idea of what to tell me about the Rebbe, but she first asked me what the Chicago Cubs, she told me what the Cubs score was that day in case I missed hearing what the game was, because she knew I was an avid Cubs fan. She even confided in me that the Rebbe was an avid Brooklyn Dodgers fan until they left for Los Angeles in the late 1950s. So I said, I myself was a Dodger fan too, so we had a mutual understanding about baseball. She also always knew the weather forecast and weather situation in Chicago. And why was that? Because she had heard from someone that I bicycle to work every day, which is true. And she wanted to make sure I wasn't braving too thick a snowstorm or too big.
Rain or shine, snow or sleet.
True. And so we had really quite a warm connection. She was like a surrogate mother of sorts. She was really someone who was so concerned and fine, refined, and attentive. And also, I got really keen insight as to how the Rebbe was really feeling or thinking about things. And I was very, very well kept in touch with the Rebbe through the Rebbetzin nightly contact with me by telephone. And it was a working system. By the time we got to Rosh Chodesh Kislev, all of the doctors involved determined that the Rebbe was no longer in need of being strapped to a monitor all the time. His heart rhythm was now very stable. His cardiac performance was remarkably stable beyond our wildest imagination. And we let him even walk part of the way home and took the car the rest of the way home to return on Rosh Chodesh Kislev. And as he explained to Dr. Larry Resnick, who was the one who escorted him home, he said, the biggest victory you might think is the heart here. He said, you're all wrong. He said, the biggest victory is that I have now a chance to have tea with my wife in the private comfort of my home every day at 4 o'clock. And I took that, it's such a beautiful word. It's really something that all of us who know what it's like to be married and know the obligations of a marriage realize that to have a little moment of privacy where there's just the quietude for a cup of tea is such a redeeming thing in the course of a busy, busy day. And the Rebbe's day was the busiest I've ever seen. And he and his wife enjoyed their little private moment together. They also were very good friends with each other. They not only love each other, they like to play little games and tricks on each other whenever they could. If they could do something that make the other one feel that it was almost April Fool's Day that day, they would do it. So they like to tease each other a little bit. And I got to know the Rebbetzin also from the standpoint of her unusual style. She was a very modest lady. She was so quiet that people in the community did not really get a chance to know her. She dressed in a very quiet, magnificent way. She shopped at a store called Bonwit Teller. It's I don't know if it's in business anymore, but Bonwit Teller was a quality store, and she would go to Manhattan on her own, driving herself into Manhattan when she needed to shop for clothing. And she also drove every week to the New York Public Library in Bryant Square in Manhattan, where she would be fascinated by books and science. And I'm told, I don't know if this is true, it has to be corroborated, but I'm told that she helped Nissan Mangel write in Nature's Corner, a little section of Talks and Tales, which I grew up with from 1950 when I became a shtickle Chabadnik in my cheder. I read Talks and Tales every week, and I would always turn immediately into Nature's Wonderland. There were so many things to learn about how bees cooperate in their colonies, or what there is to learn about the turning of the seasons and its effect on agriculture. All these things were in Talks and Tales. I got such a general science education, and I have a feeling the Rebbetzin, with all her research at the New York Public Library, had a lot to do with it. Professionally, she was trained professionally as an architect, but never went into the profession once she became, the Rebbetzin. But she had that kind of knowledge of science, math, to a certain degree of engineering as a trained architect that she learned at the Sorbonne. So it was just a very nice experience. We had occasion to meet with the Rebbetzin on certain occasions. My wife would bring my two oldest daughters were the ones who were born then. They would come in and visit. And one time we were there sitting with her in the parlor, and all of a sudden I hear pottery breaking or something. And it's my little baby daughter at that time, Becky, who has gone to the parlor, gone to the china closet and did a little bit of a job. She was the bull in the china shop kind of routine. And I was expecting the Rebbetzin to become so frantic. And she was as calm as a cucumber. She just loved little Becky. In fact, she always made a special little note to Becky at Hanukkah where she sent a little check to her for Hanukkah golf for the 5th day of Hanukkah. And she said, happy Hanukkah, baby. She always gave a very affectionate word in that little inscription on the check. But she was totally relaxed about it. Something broke that was probably irreplaceable, but she wouldn't let us know that. But that's how she was. One time I had occasion to be invited by the Rebbetzin and the Rebbe to join them for dinner, and the only 3 people with us at the table, plus Chesed Halberstam, who was the headmaster of the house. And I was so uncomfortable there because I felt I was in the presence of such refined, special, elevated people talking about such elevated things at the dinner that I must say I couldn't wait to get out of there. I suppose most of you would say you wish you could be there. I would tell you, you wouldn't want to be there. It was the Rebbe and Rebbetzin were in a league way beyond what we can imagine. And I felt I wasn't in the right circumstance. I was always very clammed up when I spoke to the Rebbe because I felt I was in the presence of such a special gift to this world that God had planted for all of us. The years went on, and I was increasingly certain of the Rebbe's stability until we decided to let him go for his first Farbrengen. It was in Yud Tes Kislev, which was shortly after he got home at Rosh Chodesh Kislev. And Larry Resnick and I attended the Farbrengen. It was my very first Farbrengen I had ever attended. And we were packed like the sardines in the 770, all packed at the benches, humped over with our hats on, our full-brimmed hats. My wife having selected a hat that was slightly off of black so it could be seen in case there was emergency. My wife reasoned that if it was slightly different with a dark gray, one could see me more quickly than just seeing all the black hats and seeing nothing, being camouflage. But we were watching the monitor under the table. No one knew we were doing it. We were sitting next to Hasidim who didn't even know who we were. And we see to our horror that as the Rebbe is giving a sikha at the first Farbrengen, the rhythm, which had been so perfect, the heart rhythm had been so perfect that we let him go home off the monitors, suddenly became very dangerously irregular. And our hearts sunk. We were in the middle of this first sikha. What were we to do? Were we to go up there, embarrass the Rebbe, panic the crowd, and ruin the Rebbe's stature as a Rebbe, or make it impossible for people to justify seeing him when they could see such problem? And we even signaled the Rebbe. He didn't see us signaling him, but we were trying to show him. I gave him the pulse signal that the pulse wasn't so good. We debated, Dr. Resnick and I debated, should we rush up to the stage to interrupt his sikha or let him do it so we don't panic the whole crowd? And reluctantly, we decided to let the Rebbe go on. We didn't want to ruin the Rebbe's future. It was that important to balance these two items of whether to save the Rebbe of this arrhythmia or whether to deny the Rebbe the right to be a Rebbe again, because the crowd would see that he's not to be tampered with, not to be taken, casually. He's too delicate with his heart attack. We let him go on, and luckily the sikha was only maybe 10, 15 minutes, and by the time he stopped, the rhythm became normal. We were so relieved. But then there was a second sikha, and the exact same thing happened. And we conveyed to the Rebbe through an envoy that the rhythm was irregular. Rebbe, please tone down the sikha. We asked that be conveyed to him. And the Rebbe gave us some hand signals. We had a little hand signal arrangement. And he said, I'm going to be okay. He signaled back. He went to the second sikha in a repeat performance. Irregular again. And this happened even a third time, a little less so than the first two times. I didn't know what to do. I said I should really just go up there to the Rebbe and ask if he could call the end of the Farbrengen at a fairly early time in the evening. Then he went to a mimer. And I had not known what a mimer was, but it certainly started different from a sikha. There was a beautiful nigun. It was very pensive, deep nigun that put all of us into a trance of sorts. And I said, maybe this will be a little bit better. I was calmed down myself through the nigun. And then I heard the mimer. And during the mimer, the Rebbe's tone was a lot different. It was a lower voice, a more relaxed atmosphere. The Rebbe was not hammering on heavy points. He was talking about concepts that I couldn't fully understand because my Yiddish command of Yiddish wasn't adequate at that time. And the rhythm was perfect. In other words, it was a state of mind of the Rebbe, relaxed, pensive, thoughtful state of mind that put him into a normal rhythm. And I was so relieved. And then I signaled him that we should probably, it was a long mimer, so I signaled him that this would be a good time to end the Farbrengen. The Rebbe fully agreed. And we went to the room and I told the Rebbe how much I apologized to him for having risked his life by letting him continue through the sikhas at risk to his life because I didn't want to ruin his future. And the Rebbe thought it over and he said, Dr. Weiss, you did the right thing. And I was so relieved that he wasn't angry. I had asked his forgiveness for having made such bad medical decisions. But I remembered that this had happened. And this was an important thing to remember because several years later, when an issue came up about the books being stolen from his library, the Rebbe was being asked by the opposing party to give a deposition. And I've never had a lawsuit or a deposition, but I could imagine that it's a very derailing circumstance. They asked, I know that in a deposition, they ask very pointed questions to try to jar you, make you so uncertain of your answers that you give the wrong answers or the wrong slant to the answers. Now, I don't see the Rebbe as being jarred or derailed. We're all human beings. We all can have things that hit our limit points. And I told the Rebbe, I said, I really can't let you do a deposition. I would rather that I argue in court that you are not supposed to give a deposition. Maybe the Rebbetzin give a deposition. And for any of you who knew about the books, the retrieval of the books, the Rebbetzin, who was so sharp and always on her toes, gave a beautiful deposition that was so compelling. It was a statement, I'm not going to phrase this correctly, but as she explained to the judge, the books are not our property. The Rebbe and the books are the property of the community. And Judge Sifton took this so seriously that he weighed heavily in his judgment on the case. For me, they brought me to the deposition as the surrogate for the Rebbe to explain about the problem that he would have or could potentially have about losing his stable heart rhythm if he were challenged too much by a very tough attorney. Well, the opposing people wanted to interrogate me before I made my presentation, so they asked me in front of the court, after I sweared on a stack of Bibles this high, that he said, are you Dr. Ira Weiss? I said, I am. I said, have you been involved in any way with the care of the Rebbe? I said, I am. And tell me, doctor, where did you take your education? And I told him the schools and the special training. And tell me, doctor, where are you licensed? And I said, well, I knew they were going to do that to me. The one who thought of it was my father. My father was never privileged to have an education. He was more in the line of a blue-collar worker. But even from the first days I took the Rebbe, he said, Ira, you got to go downtown to the Northwestern Medical School Library and look up the rules in New York of what you're privileged to do and not to do. No one had thought of that, but my own father, who was far from being a lawyer, never engaged the services of a lawyer, but thought wisely. And I took out the sheet, I photocopied the sheet of paper describing these. And so they asked me, in what states are you credentialed? I said, well, I'm credentialed as a licensed physician in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and in the state of Illinois. Tell me, doctor, are you licensed to practice in the state of New York? I said, no, I'm not, Your Honor. And I then took this out of my pocket, the thing that my father had me photocopy from the Northwestern, and I read the rule. And the rule is this, that as a consultant or a certain specialist, you can be called into another state only on the permission of the doctors who are licensed. And you're not allowed to write any prescriptions, and you're not allowed to make notes of the chart on your own, except when invited by the words of the doctors in the chart. And we did that right from the beginning. So we had complete justification for my being involved in the case. And it was given in a way that derailed the opposing attorneys so much that they were seen to be shaken by this unexpected answer. They thought they would have me nailed to the wall with the charges of having practiced without a license in the state of New York and been dismissed and even perhaps subjected to special legal penalties, including loss of my licensure in Illinois. And the opposite happened. And they were so broken up by it. It was seen on their faces that the whole court burst into laughter. And the rest was just a piece of cake. We sailed right through it and ultimately won the case about the books. But it was a moment that I remembered, and I really validly was trying to defend the Rebbe against being jarred again into going into a bad arrhythmia. I don't know how many times he was given very big challenges with the events in the world that might have done the same thing, but I wasn't there to witness it, thank God. And the Rebbe made it through. I might say the Rebbe's active years following the heart attack were 15 till he had a bad stroke. And he was so vital in those years, one would not have imagined that he had any type of heart attack. One would not have imagined that he could have done this. One could not imagine how effective he would continue to be for this long a period of time, already well into his upper years. And the biggest legacy of this period probably was the spread of Chabad to worldwide institutions and installations, because that's when the program of Shluchim really expanded on an exponential level. And this came directly as a result of his being granted the privilege of living through this heart attack. And for the time when I gave a talk to the Kinos HaShluchim, they acknowledged so much. I heard the strength of the applause and all this when I met with them at their Farbrengen, at their Kinos. And we all agreed that the expansion of worldwide influence of Chabad had a lot to do with the Rebbe retaining his strength and his commitment to his worldwide commitment to every Jew, actually, because that's what Shluchim are there for every Jew in this world. And it was a great privilege to have been able to have been part of this effort. I don't want you to remember me. I want you to remember Dr. Louis Tischel for having been the kind soul and competent doctor that he is, and also the great way he started the whole case, how he made the Rebbe come back right away with his great skill. I also want to thank all the doctors who worked with me so dedicatedly, and of course the Rebbetzin for being such a right hand to me in knowing about the Rebbe's progress. And I also have to thank all of you, all you Hasidim, who gave me just good moral support. There was never a time when I felt I was an outsider, or they said, "Oh, what do we need him for?" Or he doesn't go to our shul, he goes to his shul. It was not like that at all. We were really always like a feeling of a strong brotherhood. And I can give you some little stories if you want to hear them. I don't want to bore you or keep you up all night. It's late there already, but I can give you a little insight as to how amazing was the Rebbe in my own personal experiences. If I don't bore you, I don't want to take up time from the questions, so I will ask the Rabbi. Rabbi Newman will guide me. If I can tell one little story that's quite a fantasy story, but it's real. Would there be time for that? Okay, I see a thumbs up here. Okay.
We're doing our signs that we made up before, right?
What's that?
We're doing our signs that we made up before, right?
Okay, we made the signs, right? Like for the Rebbe's. He would do it a different way. He would sometimes hold his hand up with his hand on the pulse, show me he's okay. This would be his sign to me. But thank you. So this is a story. The Rebbe always took a strong interest in what I was up to, what I was doing. And even from the get-go, I mean, actually, the reason why Rabbi Krinsky called me, you might ask, how would Rabbi Krinsky call me? Just because I was a Cheder student years ago when I was a little child, acting like a little idiot at shul, going out to play, reading the Torah. No, it happened that when I was finishing my training, I wrote a book on heart rhythm analysis that became a very important contributor to the efforts of how to telemonitor patients and how to decipher these complex heart rhythms. If you look at EKGs, they look like spaghetti noodles flowing along on paper, but there are ways of looking at it mathematically. And I wrote a book like this called Essentials of Heart Rhythm Analysis, which became like the Bible for the technical people in the world who developed automatic heart monitor reading machines so they could immediately spot when to sound an alarm. And I was happy with the book. It came out even better than I had planned. And I decided to send a copy to my rabbi, Rabbi Schusterman, to show him what one of his stupid little Cheder students wrote years later. And the Rebbe and Rabbi Schusterman realized that it was an interesting book, but he wasn't to be reading it. So he sent that copy to his brother-in-law, Yudel Krinsky, Rabbi Krinsky. And Yudel decided the Rebbe should see this. And the Rebbe was so fascinated by the mathematics and the thought in the engineer's intrigue in this type of book that in his little study, which is not much bigger than the little children's bedroom I'm sitting here to broadcast right now, even though the library wasn't that extensive in his study, he put it on a bookshelf so he could look at it periodically to challenge himself with little puzzles. Instead of doing the crossword puzzle, he was looking at complex arrhythmias and seeing how do you actually digest this and break it down to something that can be translated to a signal. So it was actually in their midst. The little book was in their midst, the little book on on heart rhythm analysis. So the Rebbe always took an interest in all my projects. So he was asking me about a reunion I was going to attend. I went to a secular high school in Chicago, and it had a largely Jewish student body, a very nice school. And I said, I'm going to my second reunion. This was 1981. I graduated in 61 from the high school. And he was very happy. He said, "Are you going to be meeting your old friends?" I said, "Yes." And he said, did you have a lot of friends in school?" I said, "I did enjoy high school. I had a lot of nice people I knew there. So I can't wait to see them at the 20th reunion." But as Friday was coming in, going into the weekend of the reunion, I get a call from Binyamin Klein, one of the secretariat, that Rebbetzin Schneerson is not feeling so well. She had a fever. She was not able to focus on the newspaper, and all she did was read and learn and study. So she was really not herself. And there were little marks on her skin from whatever was going on underlying this. And I had remembered that when the Rebbe was first being rescued from his heart attack, he had asked me just to take a listen to the Rebbetzins' heart, just so she could be paid attention to too. And I remember having heard a little murmur over one of her heart valves that was trivial. It was a very faint murmur. I told the Rebbe, it's a small murmur. It doesn't mean the valve's very, very damaged or injured, but I'll keep it in mind. And then I thought of the illness that I was told about on the eve of my 20th reunion at high school. And I said, it sounds like this heart valve could be infected, and causing her fever and her lack of mental concentration and these little marks all over her skin. It's a disease called endocarditis. It's a very, very dangerous disease, often under-recognized, often not treated adequately or even recognized at all. And invariably, it leads to a very bad outcome. I said, I better get into New York and see what the Rebbetzin is doing here with this fever. And the Rebbe had Binyamin Klein call me back. He said, tell Dr. Weiss he should first go to his reunion, and he'll see the Rebbetzin after the weekend reunion party is over. He'll come and see the Rebbetzin. And I know the normal chassid would say, I listen to what the Rebbe says, but I said my medical thinking on this has to override even the Rebbe's wishes that I go to the reunion. Because with all his heart, he wanted to be part of my friendship from childhood. But I said, I have to do this on my own thinking. It was getting to be close to Shabbos. By the time I landed at LaGuardia, it was just about, it was into Shabbos, I would say. Fortunately, in those days, they didn't have electronic tickets. They didn't have electronic things, the turnstiles and the bus and the train. So I was actually able to get the cooperation of all the people who run the public rail and bus system in Boston, in New York, to allow me just to get on. And I did, by the way, pay later. I sent a letter with a check later thanking them. But I basically took it like a Shabbos elevator in some buildings, which just, there were no such thing as electric guides on the doors. Doors open and closed whether you went in or not. The turnstiles were all mechanical. So I felt I was taking a horizontal elevator ride in a Shabbos building. That was a horizontal elevator instead of a vertical elevator where I took the train in. By the time I got to the President Street home of the Rebbe, it was already pretty close to 10 o'clock at night. And I said, they're probably all sleeping there, but I'll just patiently knock on the door, hoping someone will hear me. With one knock, the door flew open. And Chesed Halberstam, the steward of the household, was right there waiting for me to come in. And the Rebbe, in his full Shabbos garb, his kapot, looking very nice, was sitting right next to the door, waiting for me to come in. Not only was he waiting for me to come in, but he had 4 little books, one for my wife, one for me, one for the 2 daughters. At that time, I have total 3 daughters, but the last one came later. But they were little translations of the Tfilas Hashem Siddur, so we could carry in our pockets or in those little portable books as a present. The Rebbe had known that I would override his advice. He just knew me that well. And I went in to examine the Rebbetzin, where I confirmed my fear that she did have this heart valve problem called endocarditis. And it involved a lot of work to get things started, IVs and 6 weeks of treatment, all this. And naturally, I was there the entire weekend working kind of feverishly to get things organized for her. It treated her and cured her completely. She got all her sensorium back. She was the Rebbetzin again. So it was a very successful mission from a medical standpoint. But then the Rebbe asked me, Dr. Weiss, I'm very appreciative of what you did for my wife, but what about the reunion? I said, well, Rebbe, I'll go to the 30th, God willing, maybe the 40th if I'm lucky enough. He said, but what about the 20th reunion? I said, well, I'll do my best. I'll make a few phone calls and see what went on there. And it happens that we're all asked to write a 1-page note about ourselves, telling what we've been up to in the last 20 years. And it's compiled in a little book. And I usually read half of them because I knew about half the people in the class well enough to want to be in touch with what they were doing. The Rebbe called me and he said, Dr. Weiss, I want to ask you as a friend if you'll read all the book. If there's 200 pages and you're only going to plan to read 100, I want you to read all 200 pages, please, as a favor to me. I said, of course, Rebbe, I'll read it. I wasn't sure why he was asking me to do this. He didn't know anything about my high school. And I did read all the 200 pages. And I came to a page written by a classmate named Doreen. And she's a young lady at the time, a very fine student, but I never got to know her very well. I didn't know her circle of friends very well. So it wouldn't have been a page I would have gone out of my way to read. But on Doreen's page, she described how she took care of her husband who developed kidney failure and how the two of them researched. The best place at that time was the University of Minnesota, where they did the kidney operations, the transplants, and it was a fairly new technology. And I was so interested in reading what Doreen had done for her husband and how successful he was doing with this, that I remembered that right down the little street where I live in Skokie, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago, there's a couple where the husband is trying to take care of a wife who's got kidney failure. She's my age, and she's not succeeding with the dialysis, and they're recommending a transplant. And transplants were kind of new then, and I wasn't so sure about its safety for everybody. There were certainly a lot of complications even nowadays with. But I decided to team them up with Doreen and her husband from my high school. And they became instant friends, and they guided each other. And Doreen and her husband guided our neighbors for her to get a kidney transplant at the same place where they went to, and the same doctors who were very competent and became world class at this. And I must say, even to this day, our neighbors are still down the street from us, going strong, thank God, in a miraculous story that goes back from 1981 when this, so she's one of the longest living transplants and a very successful living transplant. It's like unbelievable. I can only tell you that for this to have happened through this peculiar circumstance in 1981 is a real Rebbe story. And it's just one of many stories. We have to have many nights of many Farbrengens to tell other stories. But I want to give time to the devoted crowd that was willing to stay awake during my talk. And I noticed no one seemed to be sleeping on my time. So if any of you would like to ask some things or get some more details of what I talked about, I'd be happy to help you unravel the mysteries here. But I just want to reassure you that the stories I told sound like fairy tales, but they really, in anyone's imagination, are too hard to believe, but they really were true. That how we were fortunate enough to bring the Rebbe back with such an unusual circumstance, with such an unusual team of doctors, with such an unusual ability to create a little hospital right at 770, and with such support from the entire Chabad community that was so vital to all of us. I can't thank you all enough for having been part of that. And those of you who weren't even born then, your parents did it. So I want to thank you all and open for some questions or discussions. Rebbe, could you moderate that and find who's raising their hand?
Sure.
And speak?
Sure. I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Weiss. That was unbelievably fascinating. As someone that grew up Chabad, in my mind, in the picture, the advertisement of this event, that's how I know you when you spoke at the Kinnis HaShluchim, and I think 1 year Rosh Chodesh Kislev as well. And you don't look a day older than in those pictures. It's fascinating to hear this firsthand.
I didn't know that your rabbi likes to tell little fibs.
I have to tell you another secret. I'm not the rabbi. Unfortunately, the rabbi's wife's grandfather passed away late this afternoon.
Oh.
The rabbi made the introduction, and I'm just a random guy that's been hijacking this.
It's so hard to hear that. Oh,
so, but the rabbi did begin the Farbrengen, and surely this beautiful Farbrengen and your warm words are surely a strength and an aliyah to the neshama. That right now the funeral is taking place in Yerushalayim. So I have a number of questions that came in that I have written down here. If anybody wants to either send to me or to unmute yourself to ask, that's also great. Question number one, you just addressed this now, was how did Rabbi Krinsky find you? that was fascinating, that book. Okay, question number 2. Thank you, Dr. Weiss, for your presentation. Can you share anything you saw about the Rebbe's relationship with the Rebbetzin, or more about the Rebbetzin that we don't know so much about?
Well, I'll tell you, I didn't often see them together because at one time when I was at the dinner, I was kind of clammed up because I was in the presence of great people and didn't feel justified sitting at the table. But I will always tell you that the Rebbe always spoke with a little humor in his eye, a little twinkle in his eye, more than the usual twinkle that we see of him normally about his wife. And he would explain to me when I was telling him that, he has to be careful. He said, Dr. Weiss, you're sounding more and more like my dear wife. And she's the pessimist in the family and I'm the optimist. And he had such a cute twinkle. He only loved her for her concern about him. But it was much communicated by just looking at his eye and his little smile as he talked about how his wife was sometimes very protective or even overprotective of his welfare. But that's the kind of relationship they had. And really, I know the Rebbe was very devoted to her father, whose yortzeit we are observing today in Yud Shvat. He likewise was very close with the daughter, his wife. And I tell you, it was a marriage made in heaven. That's how I saw it. That it was really that close, and they were always concerned about each other. A couple of times the Rebbe was very concerned when his wife had a hip fracture. He was so protective of her, so loving of her. He was a wonderful husband, even though he couldn't be there as much as he wanted to be with her. But he loved his tea party with her every day. We had a chance to catch up with each other. And the interesting thing is, when we were seeing the Rebbe, we would see people treat the Rebbe with the greatest respect that he deserved. Sometimes people would even talk to him in the third person. I once asked Rabbi Groner, I said, Rabbi Groner, why do you talk to the Rebbe in the third person? Rabbi Groner would come up at 4 o'clock, would the Rebbe like some tea? I said, why don't you just ask Rebbe, would you like some tea? We'll talk in the second person. He was given so much deference that he couldn't wait to have this pattern of extreme deference broken at home. And who would break that? It would be Rebbe Schneerson, who once I heard her talking to him when I was coming by the house to pick up some medical equipment. She was challenging the Rebbe, why were you giving the Hasidim this direction when it should have been that direction? She was his intellectual sparring partner in a very nice way. And when you're going into a world like the Rebbe, where everyone's talking to you in the third person with extreme deference, and there's finally someone who talks to you like a human being, is your sparring partner to put you on the right track. It's a much needed source of the break from the usual humdrum third person address. It's hard to describe this, but I think he cherished the fact that there was someone there to give him a little challenge or a little fetch to go in another direction sometimes. We couldn't do it, that's for sure.
Wow. Okay, we have a question here on the chat. What word did Dr. Weiss say is the worst word in the dictionary? The
worst word in the German word, zu, too much of anything. And I include in that too much kindness. Sometimes too much kindness can devour you. And the Rebbe even felt that way. He would extend of himself to the limits of the earth if need be. But he knew there was sometimes when you had to put a limit on that so you could attend to the helping of others or even helping yourself or even making sure you ate a meal or something. So he was not always in favor of the extreme story of the person who didn't eat for 3 days so he could save a city. An example that would be even in the pandemic that he faced. He faced the 1918 flu epidemic, which lasted a year and a half around the world. My own namesake, my grandfather's name was Yitzchak, a very humble and very pious man who lived in Chicago, and he was taken at age 32 by that same pandemic. The Rebbe was a 16-year-old then, and he was just turning 16 when it broke loose. It was like in April of 2016. He was studying at that time yeshiva. He saw all around him people getting very sick, dying, and young people were much more affected then than the current pandemic now. he decided the wise strategy would be to isolate himself from people who might be carrying something that no one had any cure for. And the bottom line is that he studied with his father at home.
Share the mashal that he told you.
What's that?
The mashal that he gave you.
What mashal did he give me?
Tell everyone the mashal that he told you.
So, well, he first of all likened the situation to being in a forest that was on fire, where everyone in proximity to the burning tree could get burned too. And he realized the one difference between us as humans and trees is we have feet and we can leave. He saw the need to do the isolation. He also put his parents on isolation. But as luck would have it, he just heard of so many stories of people in need when they were being crushed by this pandemic, which was at that time a form of influenza A. He decided he would go out to try to help. And unfortunately, he became deathly sick. He went into a febrile delirium and recognized that you can only go so far when you are in such a dangerous situation, that you can't really go the whole limit necessarily unless you want to just give up your own potential to live and help others. And so he had to recognize there's a balance between how far you can go and how far you shouldn't go if you cherish your own life and the value of your life to others. But he was interested in how I approached it. At the time when he was telling me this, I was in the middle, as all other doctors were, of the AIDS epidemic in America and around the world. And he said, Dr. Weiss, if you were asked to resuscitate someone who has AIDS, knowing that they have AIDS, would you take the liberty of putting your life at risk to resuscitate them? Resuscitation is a lot of hands-on play. And I told the Rebbe I would unhesitatingly do it, provided that I'm properly protected against catching the AIDS. In other words, if someone's going to ask me just to jump in, I think you have to balance it out with what the Rebbe saw when he got the febrile delirium in 1917, the year after this broke out, when he decided to take himself out of the quarantine to try to help others. Or it was late in 2016 when he got so deathly sick. I think if you study what Rebbe Simchana, his mother, wrote, I think she describes some of this. I think I didn't do the reading, so I'll let you research this and get some more information on what she said about it. She was very proud of her son having decided to do this, but it kind of had its harsh aspect too. So the worst word is soup. Remember that. Too much wealth, too little wealth. Too much privilege, too little privilege. Too much power, too little power. Not a good word.
Okay, we have another one from the chat, and Dr. Weiss, you'll give me the sign. If it's
well,
right. We gotta do our
you gave me a very good time slot, so we could do it.
Okay,
My
great.
birthday party of my little baby granddaughter is all happily concluded, so I don't have to be under restraint here.
Baruch Hashem. Well, thank you again. Question: it seems that most, if not all, of the doctors who treated the Rebbe in your story were Jewish. Did the Rebbe teach you any particularly interesting Torah?
I must say I was the most brain dead of the group. The rest of the people there, like Larry Resnick, had studied on his own in yeshiva and was very learned, and he would go into depths with the Rebbe. Dr. Tischholz, who was not as privileged as I was to have any education, was inquisitive enough to ask of the Rebbe. And I was frightened enough in the Rebbe's presence so that I never had a chance to really go into. But I will say the Rebbe responded to my request. I said, Rebbe, when I'm davening with my Tehillas Hashem Siddur all my life, since I was a 5.5-year-old, going to the Cheder school after public school, I said, I just really felt a deficiency that I couldn't understand the prayers. The book is in Hebrew, and I just knew there were some prayers more commonly said than others, but I didn't really know all the words. And he commissioned Nissan Mangel, who's a great scholar, not only of Jewish items, but also of the English language. And English language is a very rich language with all kinds of connotations of different words that you have to really sort of decide what word fits best for the translation. He did a magnificent job translating the Tehillas Hashem Siddur. And I took it as a present from the Rebbe with such gratitude. I said, the Rebbe has fulfilled my need to learn something. And my davening was a lot slower. Of course, I was really taking every word for word translations. But the way the pagination was in the book, page for page, was the same page of English as on the Hebrew. It made it very easy for me to cross-check what the words were. And I became much more learned of where the prayers came from and what the meaning of the prayers were. And it made me much more committed to daven with real intent and serious thought about what we're talking about, what we're praising God for, what we're requesting of God, what we're trying to describe about our own plight in life. So I didn't go into learning. My schedule at the hospital was overwhelming. It was a daily thing. And you have to understand, when you take care of the Rebbe, all the Lubavitchers are going to call you about their problems as well from all over the world. So we had one big phone bill all the time, taking care of. This was very time consuming, to say the least, because you couldn't just brush someone off the phone. They had a life-threatening situation. So I wasn't really what you call a Torah scholar, but I was a student of the Tilas Hashem Siddur.
Okay, I'm gonna do 3 more questions. Okay, so at least we know that there's light at the end of the tunnel. We have I'm gonna combine 2 from the chat. We have from Henya Storch. Thank you, Dr. Weiss. I was nursing coordinator at 770 in the 1990s, and also my husband, Dr. Kenneth Storch, nutrition expert, also was part of the amazing team. Your medical stories brought back incredible memories. Combined with that is the question, Dr. Weiss, were you still in the picture when the Rebbe had his stroke, for those that don't know, in 1992?
Well, what happened is that the Rebbe was at the Ohel when this happened, and I got the call when I was in the middle of a patient's visit at the office, and it was a Jewish patient. I didn't want him to hear everything, but I had a little office, as I said, kept my overhead low because my income was not that high. But I had to talk on the phone carefully, not to reveal what was wrong with the Rebbe exactly. But what was available then was an agent called tissue plasminogen activator, TPA. It was developed by a boyhood friend of mine. We were children in Chicago, and he was a brilliant young fellow, and he pioneered this. Unfortunately, he developed leukemia or lymphoma and didn't live on to win the Nobel Prize that he would have gotten, but it was revolutionary in that it could dissolve a clot. And I knew exactly where this was coming from because we always heard noise from a narrowed artery in the Rebbe's neck. And for some reasons, the Rebbe had to go off of aspirin at the determination of an eye doctor who saw him because of a little bleed in one of the eyes. I didn't consider it to be such a major problem, but the decision was made by that doctor. And off the aspirin, he didn't have his anticoagulant. So his stroke occurred a week later. And I thought immediately of the tissue plasminogen activator, which was available in New York only at the Cornell Medical Center because it was a brand new item. And I knew the fellow Justin Zivin who developed it. And I knew it was a very trustworthy, worthwhile method of intervention. But because it was so new, no one was anxious to have the Rebbe being subject to it. I even called the Cornell and even laid down my credit card so they would have all their costs covered for this very expensive new approach. But unfortunately, the ambulance got lost and this and that. He didn't get there in time. He didn't get there at all. In fact, they brought him back to 770. It was way too late to make this intervention. We'll never know if we could have reversed this. But I took a role of coming in periodically just to be with the team. I had such discouraging reports from the neurologists, some of whom I knew quite well. I couldn't navigate forward because we didn't have, it was like coming to the heart attack too late to reverse it. This was the situation I was in. It was a very dreadful, hard time in my life. I was so disrupted by the whole sequence of events. I can tell you that the only thing I did on a positive note was that one time we were going to the Rebbe's room and the Rebbe was in such torture and torment that you could see he couldn't even crack a little smile. But I secretly took my little Khalil in my pocket and I whipped it out in front of the Rebbe, hoping I could cheer him up. And I played a little nigun that's recited on I think on Yom Kippur. La da 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 dum, la da 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 dum. And I played it, and it came out quite nicely on the Khalil. It was a beautiful. The intonation was just right. And that's in his little study where he was being confined was a perfect resonance chamber. So I would say orchestration was perfect. And the Rebbe listened to it And it was the only smile I saw him give in this whole 2-year period. He gave a genuine smile. He perceived the song. And I broke into tears that I felt it was almost like they talked about, I think King David, when he once played for the king. I don't know the story exactly because I'm not that learned, but I felt that I was playing for the king. But that was the only bright moment in those 2 years.
Okay, I have 2 more questions, okay? First of all, on the chats and private message that I'm getting, tremendous yasher koach and thank yous. The question of it is, ditto to all the thank yous. I've never heard about how serious and even life-threatening the situation was until you arrived. Can you speak more to that? Was there anything unusual about the recovery time or the long-term impact of the heart attack? And I'll just add, also, I know that the Rebbe speaks about this, that right after Simchas Torah, and then subsequently every Motzei Shabbat for 18 months after the heart attack, the Rebbe no longer had a Farbrengen on Shabbos, because that would have been more difficult, and the Farbrengens were Motzei Shabbos. The Rebbe actually mentions that from this negative thing came the opportunity that when there was a Farbrengen on Shabbos, only people that were in 770 were able to listen to it. I grew up in England, and they would talk about that was the golden years, those 18 months, because they were able to listen and hear the Farbrengen of the Rebbe because it was recorded. So maybe such a major heart attack, especially the way you describe, and then it's 48 hours later and the Rebbe's talking Farbrengen, but from his room.
Yeah, well, we were hesitant to let him have that first moment. I'll just say, in answer to the first part of the question, which was the extent of the heart attack, I won't give you the gory technical details by describing the cardiogram, but I'll just say from the cardiogram, we could easily deduce that through and through the wall of his whole front wall of his heart out to the side was no more any contracting heart muscle. This is what's called a very extensive heart attack. And it probably allowed a different part of his heart, the undersurface and the back surface, to do all the pumping. And it's not as strong an area by any means. It's just not designed embryologically that way. In regard to the allowance for the Rebbe to be speaking to the public, he had committed himself to his father-in-law that every Shabbos Mevorchim, he would commit himself to give a Farbrengen. Here was a Shabbos Mevorchim for the month following his illness in Tishrei, that we were going to be faced with the impossibility of giving Farbrengen. So we worked out the telephone. And of course, I told the Rebbe, please confine it, if you can, Rebbe, to maybe 20 minutes or less. And I thought that was a very liberal allotment. And I was going to be the supervisor. And you know what kind of supervisor I am. I'm a pushover supervisor. So the Rebbe came to the 20-minute mark. I started showing him my watch. We always gave little hand signal, point to the clock. It's an easy signal to read, obviously. And it was 21, and then it was 25. I don't remember the total number of minutes, but he went quite a bit over, I think way over the capacity of the allowance. And we were frantic, but his rhythm was perfectly stable. He was so happy and so relieved that he didn't have to break the promise he gave to his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, whose yahrzeit is today. So it was a very big thing. And my reasoning was this: there was a certain amount of danger pushing the envelope a little bit. But I know that sometimes if you restrict it too much, your heart will do much more poorly than if you cut a little slack. And we basically did that. And he cut his own little extra slack, but he got to do it. I'll tell you some interesting things that did develop, though. I have a friend who was a physicist at the University of Chicago named Naftali Berg, of blessed memory. And he was an inventive man. And I told Naftali that we couldn't think of putting the Rebbe into the general room to broadcast a Farbrengen with his, less than perfectly strong ability to generate a good voice, because here's a man without a microphone. So Naftali thought about a very interesting way of making a microphone on Shabbos. No electricity. Here's how it works. You talk into a little vibrating disc that's connected to a little pipe. It looks like a microphone, but it's nothing, no wires inside. It modulates the amount of flow to compressed gas, like compressed nitrogen or compressed carbon dioxide. And that makes the big diaphragm, the big speaker, vibrate. Sort of like the way the telephone works, the telephone does this electromagnetically. When you talk into the telephone disc, it causes a modulation of a current that goes into the big speaker that operates and this was the big diaphragm on a mechanical device. And we tried it out. The Rebbe was very pleased with Naftali Berg's invention. He did a mock-up of it. We tried it with the Rebbe. And then the Rebbe said, I just can't do it in front of public. People will look at this. It looks like I'm broadcasting on NBC microphone. I remember that was his term. And they'll see that I'm violating Shabbos, so they can get a farbrengen. The word will buzz like mad that I've done something that no Orthodox rabbi would think to do. And he wouldn't have done any of the malachas. There would have been no sparks, no modulation of electric current. And even modulating the flow of compressed air is like the way we modulate when we talk. We talk with compressed air, modulating our vocal cords and creating the voice patterns and the modulation of the voice, the volume. But he couldn't do it. So that's why we put him on the air. And a lot of people in the New York area got that broadcast.
Okay. Oh, Dov, question?
Yeah, just because someone asked the things that Dr. Weiss got for the Rebbe, he doesn't want to talk about himself. But having grown up in the shul that Dr. Weiss went to, he talked about he didn't go to the shul that they went to. You should, just want everyone else to hear that we learn Chabad nigunim as Dr. Weiss's nigunim. That's how we thought of them. And on Yontif we sang the Chabad v'samachta v'chagecha, all the nigunim that we knew as Dr. Weiss's nigunim. We realized only afterwards those were the Rebbe's nigunim or they were Chabad nigunim. We knew all those things as Dr. Weiss's nigunim. We realized when we got a little older, we realized where they came from.
Well,
That's
Rabbi
how
thank you.
That's how we got. That's how we got there.
Rabbi Carroll to me is like a son. I still feel he's like a son to me. But he was one of my big chassidim at the shul that I went to. It's interesting that when I went to the shul, and at that time Rabbi Carroll was a young, wonderful, very promising boy, I was invited to join the newly formed Chabad shul right down the street, on the same street almost, the Dempster Street in Skokie. And the Rebbe advised that I stay with the shul I was with for two reasons. One is that I belonged there, and secondly, that it would create a certain amount of enmity, that here the Chabad people come in and steal away one of the people who's one of the early members in the shul where Rabbi Carroll grew up as a boy. But he was one of my best Hasidim. I'm so happy to see him today.
That was the third reason why you had to stay there, because you had to teach the nigunim, Dr.
Yes.
Weiss's nigunim.
And Rabbi Carroll was not the only one. he had his fellow.
Kids also now know Dr. Weiss's nigunim.
Okay, the final question we have, and this is maybe more general, but this comes from our rabbi, and this is after all farbrengen, and I really want to echo all of the thank yous, and this was eye-opening, fascinating, and really I can't think of a better way of to connect to the Rebbe and his kashus, a real connection to the Rebbe on this day of Yud Shvat, when the Rebbe began his leadership with getting to know the Rebbe a little bit more in this unique vantage point that you shared with us, Dr. Weiss. So the final question, and maybe the Poel Mamish of where we go from here, the question is there anything that the Rebbe taught you that you revisit as a life lesson every day or often?
I think probably one of the things that maybe I came into this a little bit, but he embellished it, was the importance of really treating everyone fairly and kindly, because that was the Rebbe's hallmark. If you wanted to ask me what was the real hallmark of the Rebbe, as he meets you one-on-one, that he pays attention to what you're saying and wants with all his heart to either in person to tell you what to do or write you a letter of great meaning. And I took extra care to be communicative like that if I could, within my limited capacity, not the Rebbe's limitless capacity, to try to be kind and thoughtful and respectful of where everyone was coming from. Everyone is so different. Everyone has different levels of being able to understand something or being able to take on a job at different levels of competence. And that has to be factored in, that we have to treat each other with the kind of understanding that comes with just realizing that it's so important to be attentive to what people are telling you or asking you to help them with. And I can tell you that if you all can follow that a good example of the Rebbe, you've been great students of the Rebbe. He was very, very concerned when my father had a bad stroke and how careful he was to see that we brought some level of joy to a man who had lost his power of speech and power of movement on the right side. And he made it possible for him to have a certain amount of joy that I didn't even think of myself, because he thought a step farther, even though he was not the son, I was the son. And he didn't know my father's particular pursuits or likes. And if you read the book by Telushkin, Rabbi Telushkin, Joseph Telushkin, called Rebbe, in it is a chapter devoted to this very example of how he took an interest in my father, even though they lived totally different lives, and did something very special in his thinking about how to make my father have a little joy out of such a bad stroke. And it was really an amazing impact. Just part of what the Rebbe does for a living. I want to also ask if you can convey my condolences. I'm very, very, very upset to hear what happened to Rabbi Newman and his family this afternoon, and I hope that they can be in some way comforted by the...
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Weiss. That means a lot. We just came from the Levaya.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear this. It just breaks my heart to have heard that you go through a tragedy like this. And the special day, maybe on the special brachas of the state, there'll be special brachas for all that transpired.
Yep. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much.
And
Dr. Weiss, thank you.
For joining me for the Farbrengen for the commemoration of the 70th yahrzeit of the previous Rebbe, who has had such an impact on all of us by bringing to our community in America his impact even on World War II, even on the way we armed ourselves for World War II. There were some interesting letters you can read in some of the archives that I have at home here. His impact on me, of course, is that he sent Rabbi Schusterman to my town where he can raise me as a second father. And I'm still just...
Thank you so much, Dr. Weiss, for joining us and for sharing these unbelievable stories. And I'm sorry, did you just say that the impact that the Rebbe had on World War II?
The previous Rebbe, there was some letters.
The previous
Rebbe. The previous Rebbe wrote to President Roosevelt some very meaningful letters, which were taken very seriously by the president. And I don't think the two of them ever met face to face, but they could see that this was a very serious, it was very serious business for how to conduct our defenses in World War II. But these are the impacts. Our great Rebbes have this kind of impact on the world. Wow. It's amazing. It's amazing. We just see it as Hasidim or people who are followers of fellow Jews, but it's affecting everyone else too, whether they know it or not. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for the nice questions. They all were able to bring out little things. L'chaim, I wish I had a little. I didn't bring my l'chaim with me here. Well, I only have a water bottle.
This is the sign for saying l'chaim. You raise your you like this. It's like these signs we have.
Don't publicize that I used water.
Amen. L'chaim.
Looks like
L'chaim.
L'chaim.
Water works
too. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us and your experiences. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today on this special day. And Bez Hashem, we'll see each other once again with a lot of simchas, a lot of happy news to share. And Bez Hashem will all take to heart what Dr. Weiss taught us and share with us tonight. And tomorrow will be a different day.
Thank you, and my best wishes again to the family, the rabbi and his family, for their loss today. All good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Weiss, and thank you, Shlomi and Kiki, for a wonderful program.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Hare.
Bye-bye.
Yossi, I just want to say thank you so much for moderating. You did an unbelievable job.
That's short notice.
and on such short notice. Dov, we never met in. Listen.
Mhm.
Okay.
Vaishio esamecha, varech estachlosecha.
You muted yourself?
No, Rabbi, you're in the car, and so you're not going to disturb anyone. I'm going to sing loud. I'm going to wake up the whole house. So you take over the singing.
Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it, and Bez Hashem will have many more for bringing us to come. And we'll make the recording available if anyone wants it, they can reach out. And the video will be sent out.
All right. L'chaim, l'chaim. Yom tov.
Chaya.